Yeah, I'm your biggest fan. Hey, Max.
No, just
Exciting. End the music now. Huge welcome to all of you on this Thursday morning. Really lovely to see so many of you here. So just to introduce the session, my name is Mags and I help out with the Trust the People project, and I'll be one of your co-facilitators this morning. Greg, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Greg. I'm also going to co-facilitate today, which is exciting.
So I'm just going to walk us through some housekeeping to get us started. While I'm doing that, do feel free to pop your name and where you're calling in from in the chat. It's always really nice to get like a geographical sense of where it is we're all coming in from. So if anyone has any accessibility needs or anything that we can do to help you be more present here this morning, do feel free to put that in the chat as well. You can private message that to me or Greg if you prefer. So do mute yourself when you're not speaking, just so we don't get feedback through the session. There's a little microphone symbol on the bottom left of the toolbar which you can click on. And when we communicate in the breakout rooms, we'll be using hand signals. Now, some of you here might not be familiar with those. So if you want to speak, you just raise your index finger. If you don't understand something and you need a clarification, it's a C. If you need to kindly tell somebody to wrap up because you don't have much time in your breakout room, you can just kindly make a circle shape. And to show agreement, it's jazz hands. But if you would like to speak during the main session itself, because there's a lot of faces here, so we can't always see your hand signals. So just write in the chat stack, and then we'll come to you. So this workshop will last about 2 hours, and you'll get a follow-up email with all of the resources and links that we talk about, and yeah, any other relevant information. So this workshop, for a bit of context, it's part of the Trust the People learning program. And for those of you who don't know, Trust the People is a movement which is trying to support the growth of community democracy in the UK, in the hope that it will lead people to shaping a society that serves the needs of the people and the planet. And it was born in Extinction Rebellion's Future Democracy Hub, but it now extends far beyond, and I'm sure we've got people who aren't from Extinction Rebellion here. Huge welcome to you if that's you. And yeah, the project is kind of supported from people from a range of different backgrounds and democratic movements. And it was started because we just believe that we can work together to create a much better society than the one that we're in now, which is failing us across the board. Yeah, we just share a dream that people need to be able to thrive and not just struggle to survive. And things need to be more equal, and we need to address the climate emergency. So one thing that underpins all of these things that are wrong is our democracy, because it isn't fit for purpose at the moment. So this online learning program, of which this is week number 4 of the 5-week course, all about supporting community democracy and helping people to share the skills to connect with each other and work with each other to sort of transform your local communities. So last week we looked at how to engage your community and reach out to people from across your neighborhood. And this workshop will kind of build on that and build on the how to run a People's Assembly. So it will cover, yeah, some like tips and tricks and things to bear in mind if you're running a People's Assembly. So don't worry if you've not been to the how to run a People's Assembly training. There is a recording of that which we will make available to you. But yeah, this should give you a sense of what an assembly is all about. And to start things off, we've got a nice little video that yeah, just does a really great job of showing how magical assemblies can be. So over to Greg to press play on that one.
Particularly around governments, particularly around power.
Politicians get into power and they're just a bit condescending or contrarian. They know better than you. They know how things work. Can't you just let them get on with it? No, this is our society. This is our democracy. All we want is to make decisions together.
Ας πούμε, η δημόσια βουλή, η βουλή της πλατείας. Και ξαφνικά βρίσκαν ένα βήμα αυτοί οι άνθρωποι να πούνε τον πόνο τους ουσιαστικά. Αυτό που νιώθανε, αυτό που τους συνέβαινε, αυτό που δεν μπορούσαν να πούνε πουθενά.
The challenge to take democracy further could enable humanity to peacefully resolve a lot of the challenges that today are presented as if they are so huge, and insurmountable.
Και στην πραγματικότητα θέλουμε να καλλιεργήσουμε μια άλλη κουλτούρα της συμμετοχικότητας, να αναλαμβάνουμε, να κάνουμε πράγματα και σε έναν βαθμό να καθορίζουμε τις ζωές μας. Αυτορύθμιση, αυτοθέσμιση, όλο αυτό το πράγμα.
This issue in Ireland could never have gotten to the point we're at today were it not for the Citizens Assembly. We would have been years getting there, if we ever got there.
If you give the right to speak and the right to decide to everyday people, it has happened again and again in the world. They come up with excellent choices.
They are free to take their decisions without having to think of the next elections, without fear of losing the next elections. So they can serve the long term and the common good much better than elected politicians can on their own.
It's a new layer of democracy. Oh, you can't have too much democracy. Democracy should be an expression of the will of the people.
Oh, such a great video there. I think it's a trailer for a much longer one, so we'll send you the link to that in the follow-up email. It really is worth a look. And so that video, it shows you little bits of a citizens' assembly, so the one that was in Ireland, and then also some people's assemblies or community assemblies that took place in Greece. So if you're wondering, like, what is the difference between these types of assembly? They're all kind of based on a similar setup. So all of them have in common the three sections.
So there's the input bit, which is the sort of information that frames the deliberation. The bit that gets the conversation going. And then there's the actual deliberation part itself, where people come together and everyone's heard equally, and there's enough time and space to discuss the question. And then there's the last phase, the kind of integration phase, where everything is pulled together into some sort of coherent sense of the decision or the will for what people are saying.
Brilliant. So yeah, a citizens' assembly is different from a people's or a community assembly in that it's done by sortition, which means that people are selected to join it, and they're selected from all groups of society in order that the sample that makes up the assembly is representative of everybody. And it's much more an official thing, and it feeds into a more official process. Now, a people's assembly or a community assembly, it's self-selecting. So one is held, and then people who want to come just sort of turn up. And that means that the people organising it have to really pay a lot of attention to making it as inclusive and accessible as possible. Because if you don't do that, then you're being exclusive to like people in your neighbourhood and that wouldn't be fair, and it would reduce the legitimacy of whatever that assembly came up with. So it's a really powerful model, as I'm sure you got a sense of from that video. It's inclusive and empowering, and it's tried and tested. There's communities all over the world that are using people's assemblies to manage their own affairs, and decisions get made out of assemblies that really do prioritise the needs of the people. There's a marked difference from our sort of political system that we have now. Loads of amazing examples in the UK. Torridge Common Ground, it's a place in Devon where they've used community assemblies in order to find candidates from the local community to run in local elections. When in North London, which Greg's going to talk to you about shortly, the Black Lives Matter movement has hosted community circles in order to channel the Black Lives Matter energy into sort of a more formidable force for change. There's huge amounts of examples. It's big in Spain as well. and Rojava in Kurdistan, they run their entire society on the assembly model. So with that introduction had, we're now going to go into breakout groups of 3 for about 10 minutes. And the question you're going to be discussing is, what are your dreams for assemblies in your neighborhood? So I'm going to put that in the chat for you now.
All right, see you soon.
Lovely stuff. All right, so we've got everybody back. So who would like to share some of what you discussed? You just put stack in the chat and then we'll come to you. It wasn't long enough. Okay, so it sounds like you got into some quite good conversations then. Sorry, we had to cut them short for time. Really good points. It's like finding that common ground somehow that will enable all those people with all their different views to sort of come together and think about what they have in common rather than what divides them. Absolutely, yeah, I'm really glad that was shared. For those of you who don't know about climate emergency centres, we'll send you links to some info in the follow-up email. Just briefly, they're like a self-funding way of taking over, a legal self-funding way of taking over a derelict building in your neighbourhood. They're absolutely fantastic. So yeah, we'll send you some information. And the idea is that they use the assembly model so that they're run sort of for and by the community. Really important point. So effective assemblies, like they happen on a bedrock of really getting to know your community and what matters to them. Like they don't happen in a vacuum. There is like work that kind of needs to be done if they're going to be effective. Greg, I'll pass over to you for this next bit.
Thank you, Mags, and thanks for those sort of glimpses of visions. Just to say how we'll use the rest of our time here this morning. We were thinking about running this workshop in a similar sort of way to how an assembly might run. So those sort of 3 parts where Mags and I give some input with some sort of information, some sort of like advice, tips that we've picked up through talking to people. And then we move into a bigger, chat again, where we go into breakout rooms and get to really flesh out our dreams a bit more. So for the person whose name I forget, who said that they didn't have enough time, we're going to have some more time later to really go into how we might do this ourselves. And then we'll come back together and do the integrating part where we pull together all those different ideas. So to start with the input, sort of broken up into 2 parts, and we're going to start talking about the first assembly you might run, and then we'll move into how assemblies might build on each other. The difference between a people's assembly and a community assembly isn't huge, but we thought it was worth calling them slightly different things. A people's assembly is a kind of like framework model that's used a lot in XR and around the world. And a community assembly is like a specific implementation of it. Do you know what I mean? So a community assembly is like a style of people's assembly, if you like, or it's an interpretation of a people's assembly. And as Mags has already said, it's, people's assemblies you can use in all kinds of ways. You can use them, during a protest. You can use them as part of a bigger group trying to reach a decision about something. But what we mean by community assembly is really this kind of blank slate thing where people who haven't been involved in activism, haven't been involved in campaigns or in a social movement or whatever, can come in, feel like it's their space, feel like they can speak, and can kind of like gain agency together. So it's that version of the People's Assembly that we're exploring today. So let's get into it. Okay, just getting some messages in the chat. Thanks for that. I'm going to start just talking through some nuts and bolts things that are important to keep in mind when trying to run your first assembly. And I guess just a tiny recap for those who were or weren't in the last module. That was called Engaging the Community. And as Mags just said, this isn't a step that can be missed out. This is something that is really crucial to building and creating a really good community assembly. So in that workshop last week, we talked about 3 kind of like attitudes or ways of working that are really important. We talked about doing things locally, paying attention to what's there, collaborating with existing groups, really doing the work of noticing what already exists where you are, so that when you come in to start doing your assembly, you're well informed about what people care about. You've already sort of like hung out with different types of people, so that you're not sort of like bringing an entirely alien thing to a place and plopping it down, but you're bringing in a process that is going to work well with what's already there. And the last attitude was inclusivity, right? So we talked a lot about things to think about to try and make your space the most inclusive it can be. So yeah, there's really no substitute for doing that groundwork of deep hanging out, etc. So first sort of things that you might want to think about when running your first assembly is where are you going to hold it? So some good ideas are local parks have been working quite well for people, potentially village or town halls or community centres, but aiming for neutral spaces is quite important so that people don't feel turned off already, like, oh, I would never go to, the pub or wherever it is. And also thinking quite carefully about accessibility. What can people get to quite easily? If it's a building, does it have, wheelchair access? Can non-drivers get there? These kinds of questions are quite important. And then once you've got this space and you've set it up, I guess there are some really small things that might sound obvious, but I think it's just worth repeating, that really help to craft and hold the space. And one is really obvious, but I've been to loads of meetings where this doesn't happen, and it's just welcoming everyone when they arrive. So in your little organizing crew of the people that are organizing this assembly, have a couple of people dedicated to welcoming the newcomers. Having a tiny interaction with anybody really helps you feel relaxed and as though you belong there, you're in the right place, you haven't messed up. And also having these informal conversations is a big part of the work, right? And it lets you gauge a kind of feeling for the group. And you can even start by asking people, what do you hope to get out of today? What's going on for you? So that's an important sort of thing to remember to do. Another sort of maybe trivial, banal thing is, collecting contact details. So this is a really important way if we want to build these assemblies and we want to maintain relationships. Having one or two people dedicated to collecting everyone's contact details, with a little sort of tick box that says that they're happy to be contacted, is really important. And I guess thinking about running this thing in the same way that you might think about being a good host at home, so you're aiming to cultivate a nice atmosphere. You might want to bring food, you might want to, if you're me, have some intro music. Making it an event and then thinking carefully about that. And I guess last things to say about inclusivity is paying attention to that. And this isn't a sort of exhaustive list of things to think through, but it's really important to think about how families can be included. Can you organize a creche safely for your assembly? We were doing this webinar yesterday with the people in Torridge, and one of the councillors, Kay Corf, who's an incredible woman, she only turned up to her first assembly because it said on the flyer, families and kids welcome, there'll be things for them to do. So if they hadn't done that, this astonishing councillor wouldn't have joined them. So it really matters. And I guess just being attentive to other access needs, wheelchair access, are there toilets? Will people be able to hear well? And putting these on the invitation and on Facebook is a really important way to signal that you're paying attention to it, and that people with different access needs know that they can turn up and it'll work for them. Because there's a lot of kind of ambiguity sometimes when these things aren't talked about. It's like, will it be accessible for me or not? So be clear, be clear about the limitations as well. Okay, so those were some sort of like housekeeping things that are just important to keep in mind. And now we'll move on to, yeah, I guess the nuts and bolts of the process itself. So assemblies tend to revolve around a question that a group is asking together and trying to figure out an answer to together. So the question in a community assembly is quite a hard thing to get right, because we have to strike this balance between creating a space that is going to go somewhere, where there's going to be a clear kind of outcome, potentially there's action that can come out of it. It's important that it goes somewhere so that people don't feel like their time is wasted, especially because the people who we really want at these assemblies are probably going to be people who are short of time as well. So we want it to go somewhere, but we also don't want to predetermine the outcome. So there's a kind of like perfect balance to be struck here in formulating the question. Yeah, we need to hold the sessions in a way that maximizes the chance of action happening by the people who turned up. So I would love to just spend a minute going into pairs, thinking through what possible questions are, and then Mags and I will run through examples of questions that are being used at the moment. So just have a quick brainstorm, and we'll take 2 minutes each to think through some of the possible issues or questions or framings that we can base our community assemblies on, so that there's a reason that people are coming, but so that it's also open for the people that come to shape it themselves. And this is, this is an ongoing kind of question that we've got to be able to think through. But yeah, let's spend a minute starting to think through it now. And I'll make some new breakout rooms. All right. So just a couple of minutes each, and then we'll come back. Amazing, thank you. Yeah, it's like quite an incredible moment, all of the mutual aid stuff, isn't it? I mean, that's a really amazing foundation for community democracy. Some great questions coming in the chat. Yeah, what does a fair recovery after COVID look like? How should our town use the open space that's just been bought by the town council? What should we do with the meadows in the village? Neil's got a great one. What does your ideal street or village look like? I like that a lot. David Blackmore's going straight for gold. How do we get to carbon net zero by 2030? What 3 actions do you want the council to take? These are really great questions. Thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, and Nick, if you could type it, that would be excellent. What if questions? Yes, Kate, what if questions really open up the imagination. Yeah, and how do people feel about issues? I'll just share some ideas that we've been mulling around where I live in West Yorkshire. We're holding an assembly this weekend in the park, socially distanced, of course. And so we've been coming up with some invitations. The first one was this, which, this was my idea. And I think there are some good arguments for it, but there were also some good arguments against it. But anyway, our general thing is, all of these crises are connected. Let's come together and figure out how they're connected and what we can do about it. So that was the first version of that, which got shut down a little bit because of the foul language. And we've gone with this one actually now. What's going on? Is this working? So yeah, all of these issues, and then what can we do? So trying to center like the agency that we might have as a community. Yeah. Mags, what are you up to? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so in my neighbourhood, things are a little bit different compared to where Greg is. So I'm in North Surrey. Things are generally quite traditional and sort of small c conservative here. I mean, like keeping things the way that they have been is quite important. I know at the beginning of the workshop, I think somebody shared that they weren't too sure how an assembly could work where they were, because I don't know, maybe some people have less of a burning for change perhaps, but then at the same time, like, do we want to be making those assumptions about the people in our neighborhoods? Like, it is a tough one. It is. So one thing that we're going with where I am is the greenbelt issue. So if anyone doesn't know, greenbelt is like legally protected land that is around built up areas, and it's protected from being developed. But where I am, lots of developers have been buying up greenbelt all over the place, and now the council are trying to release 19 greenbelt sites in our borough to be built on. And there is a lot of resistance to this across the entire community. Like, this issue is something that unites people, no matter which way you vote, what age you are. Like, nobody wants it to happen. So as much as, I mean, personally, I'd much rather run a community assembly with Greg's flyer, like that would fit me more, but it's not really about me. Like, you kind of need to have a bit of humility with these things, I suppose. And like, I want to help my community, you know, become strong and achieve change about things that matters to them. So I think going with the greenbelt thing and just seeing how people respond to having like a taste of participatory and like deliberative democracy, like do people like it? And maybe if they do, it might open doors to discussing other things. But yeah, I think the community around here, like, it would be great if, you know, we could become like a formidable force to be reckoned with, so that the council and that the developers, you know, they can't just help themselves to our land. It is our land. That's what it was designated as, and it's absolutely shameful that they're trying to take it away. I do care about this issue. Framing the input of the discussion is a really important thing to get right. And I noticed in the chat, some people were kind of thinking, well, how do you do that? One of the recordings that you'll get is from a session that was run earlier this week about how to develop like good input. So you'll know that then the session always starts with the input, and then you move into the deliberation, and then finally you'll integrate all of the discussion together. So some examples of what an input can look like, you could have a testify, which is like opening the mic up to anybody who wants to come along and speak about their own feelings about the issue at hand. Always a good idea to time that and keep it to within 2 minutes. You don't want people talking loads and loads, because obviously the assembly is about hearing from everybody. You could have an expert panel and perhaps a presentation or a video. An important thing to bear in mind is that if you are choosing people to come and speak, to testify, like, do choose a woman first. There is research that shows that if you have a woman speak first, then the later participation of other women in the crowd is much higher, and there isn't a similar effect for men. Like, men will just tend to come and speak like whatever. So just thinking a little bit more about the input, it's really important to just be wary of having input that is too like politicized or intellectual or academic or otherwise inaccessible to people, because the point is that you don't want to make people feel alienated from what's going on. Like, the beauty of a good community assembly is that it feels grassroots, and it feels like it's about what matters to people, and it's about what's going on for them in their everyday lives. It's not some kind of ivory towers thing about, it's not, don't make it too conceptual. Yeah, so people need to feel like they belong there, and having good speakers in that opening bit is really important, because people are going to know very early on if this is a place for me, or actually coming was a mistake. So before we move on to how assemblies can build on each other, I just wanted to share some small insights into like facilitating an assembly like this. So some really key things to bear in mind are, you know, like, be flexible and attentive to the needs of your audience. So perhaps those of us who are in XR, for example, like will bandy around terms like check-in, like everyone take a moment to check in with your neighbor. We're so used to that, aren't we? So we have to think really carefully about how the words and the terms that we use are going to sound to people who aren't used to sort of facilitated spaces. So maybe you would reframe that as something like, you know, can everyone take a couple of minutes just to share with your neighbor, how are you doing today? Like, what are your hopes and dreams for this space, for example? Make sure we explain the terms that we use and why we're doing them. I know there's one lovely example from some of the North London community circles where rather than just say active listening, can everybody please, you know, do active listening? It's kind of explained in terms of, you know, this community circle is for Black Lives Matter, and we know that lots of people of colour are excluded from lots of spaces in society, and when they are there, they're not listened to. So here in this space, in this assembly, you know, we're all going to really listen to each other and what's being said. So carry that with us through this whole session that we've got this afternoon, for example. And yet there's also another thing to balance. So you're going to be careful about over facilitating. So, you know, people don't want to feel like they're always being sort of kept in line, and there's a language that they don't understand that they have to use. Like introducing lots of new practices like hand signals, that can be a little bit alienating. It is tough, I think. Once you've experienced what meetings are like when you use hand signals, it's kind of hard to maybe leave some of them at the door, but it might be a good idea to do that just to make sure that that the people in your assembly don't feel like they can't contribute because they can't remember what to do with their hands, for example. And a key thing in the final third of it, so when the integration part is happening, it can be a really good idea to, as you're like asking all of the breakout rooms to share whatever it is that they've talked about, you can start to weave in next steps into this. So if you're noting like common themes are coming up, you can start asking for volunteers for maybe working groups to set up to address some of these things. So as the integration goes on, people are really getting a sense of how it's feeding into next steps. But I mean, that will be something that as we grow in confidence with facilitating these spaces, it will come to us more and more. So that takes us into the next section. So before we break out and discuss how assemblies can build on each other, I'm going to hand over to Greg, who's going to walk us through a bit of a case study.
Thanks, Mags. Yeah, is everyone okay? Is everyone sort of, do we need a little stretch? I need a little stretch. Oh. Whenever I'm on Zoom, I like sort of tense up and like my whole body sort of becomes this weird, like crinkled crisp. So I've got to pay attention to that. Okay, so I won't take too long on this, but it's a really great story that I want to share with you all. And yeah, it is sort of slightly inspired by the work that we've done in Trust the People. And it's Black Lives Matter, and now it's sort of coming back around and teaching us, you know, it's this sort of great relationship going on there. But there's a group of activists in North London who are organizing these Black Lives Matter community circles. And yeah, I was sort of spending some time with them and learning about this sort of process that they're going through. And so just wanted to share some insights from that. So these are really incredible kinds of community assemblies happening in parks all across North London. And they're sort of born out of the new energy and rage provoked by the murder of George Floyd in America, which has brought lots of people together to start organizing around racial injustice. And it's a really amazing example of, the way that community democracy skills can be used to bring people together and build kind of movements. And they're really, you know, some of them are really difficult conversations to have, right? It's a really sort of like deep divide in our society. There's lots of pain. There's lots of shame. There's lots of really big emotions. And I found that the assembly model really helps hold all of those. So just walk through some of the different, I guess, learnings from what's going on there. And one of the big questions and fears about doing assemblies is, what if nothing comes out of the assembly? I sort of think this a lot and get this question a lot. You know, if you like get a bunch of people together and you'll have a big chat, what if it's just a rant and nothing happens? I think this is really valid, right? Because we don't want to waste people's time. We don't want people who are short of time to turn up and feel like, oh, well, nothing came out of that. We want to do our best to make these assemblies really galvanizing events, right? So in London, what they were doing was being really explicit about the purpose of the assembly as turning ideas into action. And they would say this a lot in the framing of the assembly. You know, we're here because we want to take action together. We want to make concrete, tangible changes in our community. So this really helped kind of foster a sort of action-oriented culture. So that's sort of related to what Mags was talking about, in where you're facilitating in a kind of action-oriented way. But really interestingly, there was a kind of realization after quite a few of these assemblies happened that a lot of amazing things were coming out of the evolving conversation and the connections that were being made and the trust that was being built, and that it wasn't, you know, action as they imagined it, which, yeah, at first was sort of thinking, you know, we want really tangible things. We want to like get stop and search banned. We want like a project group to come out of this to start organizing. But there were other sort of like subtler, really meaningful things that started to emerge. And it sort of changed everyone's idea of what action was and what it meant. So for instance, you know, there was a woman with 3 kids who turned up who said, you know, because of these assemblies, for the first time, I feel like people are looking at me and smiling, and I feel safe and free to express myself. And that's magic, right? I mean, who knows what can happen when people start to feel like they can do that. So the sense of like what action is and what success is kind of evolved over time. And it was clear that if the group moved too fast, if it started jumping into projects already, they might not work because they didn't have the solid ground of trust needed to make this kind of difficult work. So this is another sort of balancing act, right? And I feel like Mags and I are just kind of presenting these things that need to be balanced rather than this like perfect way of doing it. But the balancing act is, you know, action and building trust and community. So there are no hard rules here. We need to kind of use our intuition. And it also became really clear that the community assembly and the organizing around it needed to accommodate different speeds of working. So some people are going to have more time and energy and want to get really involved, and that's great, and they should be able to. If they can't, they might get bored and leave. And other people might not, and they might feel quite quickly alienated by like a really fast-paced thing that's moving beyond what they're able to get involved in. So what happened was working groups would kind of get set up that would happen in parallel with the assembly. So the assembly happens, you know, it's happened a few times, and there are 3 big areas that they want to work on. You know, there's outreach to the Black community in London. There's you know, police sort of like reform and monitoring, you know, and there's something else which I can't remember right now. There are these different sort of like areas of work that needs to get done, and there are groups that do some of that work outside of the assembly. And this is great, right? Because you can accommodate the people who can come to the assembly but don't have time otherwise to start really doing this work, and their voice still matters. So it's really great that you can have these 2 parallel things going on. And I guess one thing that became clear is that you've got to keep a healthy relationship going on between them. And what I mean by that is the working group needs to always be informed by what's coming out of the assembly. The assembly almost needs to sort of set the agenda for the working group and what it's focusing on. And the assembly needs to hear from the working group and what they're doing, the action and the work that's taking place, so that its conversation isn't starting again each time. It's still building. And also, you know, when new people come to the assembly, it's important that those new people can go and join the working groups if they like. So anyway, trying to describe this kind of interactive process between the two. And I guess just to round off, it's really important that each assembly doesn't start from scratch, but that if new people join it, they can still input. So one way to do this is just trying to create a sense of the assembly is learning each time that it does it. So what you might do, you might read the summary of the last assembly at the start of the next one in the input. And you might talk about, you know, the different working groups' work and what they've done in between the assemblies. It gives a sense of a kind of continuity, as well as, you know, emailing the summary of the assembly discussion to the people that have turned up, maybe posting the results online. All of this helps to like build something out of all of these conversations, which is what matters. They can't just be kind of, you know, floating things that are one-offs. So long term, there's, you know, dreams that we might have of how these assemblies could eventually work. And I think the big inspiration for us is the way that in West Kurdistan, in Rojava, with about 2 million people, they're basically using assemblies to structure and decide and govern their whole society. So at the most bottom level, you know, they've got sort of 400 households or so that are part of an assembly that federates up to a kind of like and like neighborhood village council that goes up to a district people's council, and that goes up again. So we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but holding on to that, you know, that possibility, I think is really important. It's kind of like a bit of a horizon, you know, and if we don't reach it, fine, we're still doing great work. But I think it's important to think about the way that this work could evolve into kind of like really serious systemic change. So we've come up with a bit of a kind of vision, dreamy document that draws on some of these things happening already and kind of lays out what this could look like without being, you know, too prescriptive. So we'll share that with you all in the follow-up email. And that's basically it. And now I'm going to pass back to Mags.
Yeah, thank you for that, Greg. I always think it's really beautiful to like locate, you know, these dreams of assemblies and what they could be, and thinking about like the context in the UK and other countries now. Like the systems we have are so broken. So getting organised from the grassroots up, I mean, there's no meaningful opposition to what's going on happening at the national level, really. So it is about communities like stepping into their power and making the changes that nobody else is going to make, because all of the power structures we have are, you know, they're corrupted, aren't they? I know that might be a little bit divisive, so maybe don't frame your assembly with exactly that. But yeah, like the transformative potential of these assemblies is huge, and there's a lot that they could be doing. So having shared like various thoughts with you, we're now going to go into the final breakout group session of this, and we're going to discuss like what kind of assembly might you run in your area. So how might you frame it, and you know, who is it going to appeal to? How would you frame your invitation? So think about, you know, things that are relevant to you locally. What people in your neighborhood would come. I'll put some of these questions in the chat for you all to think about. So you'll have about 20 minutes to explore that with each other, and then we'll send you a little reminder when you've got 5 minutes left, and then just try and come up with maybe the top 3 or 4 things that were most salient in your conversation, and then we'll share those and have a bit of a discussion at the end. So Greg, if you want to do the breakout group magic, I'll pop the questions into the chat. Hope you had lots of good chats in that time. Would anybody, any note takers from their group like to feed back some of what was shared? If you put Stack in the chat, and then we'll come to you.
Hey, yeah, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. One of the ones is that you don't maybe have to sort everything out in the first assembly. You know, you can kind of have an initial one and then have a series of assemblies that are kind of progressively getting more into the topic. I guess that was kind of what Greg was talking about earlier, but Neil was also talking about it in our group, and just kind of starting off with maybe very broad ones that are about, like, you know, what's on your mind regarding this community, what's getting under your skin, and I think a related point was about not maybe starting off with climate change, because most people I think a lot of people do care about it, but there might be more pertinent issues to specific communities that they need to deal with first.
Two things came up for us. The first was around connection, and we were talking about how do we reach out to people, and perhaps a way that's better than door knocking, which people might have reservations about at the moment. A better idea is to go for pre-existing groups, and for example, food banks. And that they're a good example of something that's offline, which is also really important, but also to go through groups, say like COVID, community organising Facebook groups. We also, a second thing that came up for us was also the issue of when. So when do you bring up certain topics? And it's good to go with hot topics for your area, whether that's issues around the Black Lives Matter movement, or perhaps flooding. So it's really important to time these things when the issues feel urgent for people. Thank you.
What came up was inclusive, you know, being as inclusive as possible, using creativity, playfulness, and visioning within the whole session as well. Trying not to make it, you know, all about the issue, but using that in some way as well. Having quite an issue that includes as many people in the community as possible, and really considering how you frame the issue, you know, so it's not too scary, but maybe is challenging enough. I'm sure I've missed, and then we thought food was a great one, and air pollution was a great one, because it would include, you know, as many people, more people than more specific things. That's me.
Yeah, and so in our discussion, it came out like a lot of difficulties within the communities. Some were talking about like how we can build like a citizen assembly if around my area there is like racism, or there is no sense of community. So we were like focused on the need of connecting with everybody, and also like as there is not that connection, like how we are going to build an invitation if we don't actually know what they actually want. So it was that was like a key thing for us, like what they actually want, because yeah, as there is no connection. And then also when you have like a really bad situation in which your community, there is just like a few people that are really into getting together and help, how to get the opposite viewers, like the more conservative parts, and yeah, how to connect fully with the whole community was the main point.
Yeah, lots of common ideas there. Like my group talked about how to word the invitation so that it would appeal to as broad a cross-section of the community as possible, and not preempting the outcome. Like sometimes some topics people will think about, like they know what they want already, but how to put that to one side so that you can have as open an assembly as possible. There's a real tension there that we have to try and hold. And also someone made a lovely point about we've got a tendency to fill in the gaps, and we have to hold ourselves back from that and just allow the assembly to you know, for any like insights just to come out of it or organically, because we can close doors without meaning to when we kind of jump in too quickly and preempt things. So is there anything that's not been shared yet that anyone would like to mention?
Basically, our group, I think it's important to say, someone flagged up the fact that it's difficult work, and that we have to have endurance, that's her word, for this, and to be prepared to feel uncomfortable. And so we felt that it's good to recognise that aspect of this. And also we talked a bit about the barriers, helping, what are the barriers for people attending, that's one thing. And the thing about making it really fun, and thinking about ways it can be a party that leads into something, that leads into the assembly afterwards. And then lots of really good sort of like issue-based ideas. One for me in my own town, which is School Streets, which is about closing off an area of town to traffic or restricting access, and that links in very much with the climate issue. So it's possible to bring the conversation around to that if we do a People's Assembly on that.
Yeah, it's that idea of thinking global and acting local, but kind of helping like a segue for your community to think about wider things if what they're immediately concerned about is maybe a bit more local.
There are two things going on in Cambridge. Graham, who's also here, is he's with me working in a group around a road closure and the kind of binary conflict that's kind of arisen from that, where residents are happy that traffic is reduced, pollution is reduced, and the traders are terrified that they're going to, you know, lose business over this road closure. And it's also the closure between two wards in our towns or our city. So we've got a brilliant opportunity here, but we're very much at the stage of doing the background work, just getting enough people on board interested in the notion of an assembly, because we're going to have to deal with this conflict. There are marches up and down the road almost every weekend, pro and for the closure. And it's also made very difficult because it's a county council issue, and the city council has very little power to actually deal with it. So the county council is very remote. So there are lots of complications here in finding it. But my vision is that we have neighbourhood assemblies, and that ultimately we need an integrated policy for the whole city. And so, you know, this vision of having a federated assembly structure coming up to the city level so that we have a city solution in the end. I don't know whether Graham would like to add to that, but Kathy's is much more on what we're going to do in the rebellion, but which will kind of link in with this too.
So we're going to have a sort of event on one of the parks called the End of the Pier Show, which it denotes that we're going to be underwater at some point. So we're going to have a pier. So we're going to have music and poetry and things for kids to do, and a lot of people hang out in the park, so we're going to attract those people. But the wider thing is about how we get the people of Cambridge to feel like they can have an effect or have something to say about any of this, because I think most of the time a lot of the people don't. We're going to do open questions so people can answer questions. We're going to make poetry out of the open questions, and we're hoping to do an assembly and kind of see where it goes from there, really. So it's a sort of starting point. Yeah.
In our group, Linda was talking about like sofa chats, having like outdoor, like on the high street, sort of having an outdoor lounge, setting up an outdoor lounge where you can, you know, just chat to people coming past. I don't know if you want to say more about it, Linda, and about the partnership with the British Heart Foundation. And obviously air pollution and the amount of people that die each year.
It was just that we had set up 5 sessions working with the British Heart Foundation in Taunton just prior to lockdown. We managed one of them, and the idea was to get ideas from passers-by from our local community about the kind of issues that they wanted to talk about. So they were just chats. And so the British Heart Foundation lent us sofas. We set up an outdoor lounge. We had a standard lamp and rugs and things, coffees and teas. And we were asking people just to stop and have a chat about anything they wanted to chat about, and a guest book. And it was really interesting. Actually, lots of people didn't want to sit on the sofa. Maybe that's because COVID had just started at that time. We weren't so aware of it, or it was threatening to sit on the sofa. I don't know. But some people did, some didn't. But they would stop and talk to us, certainly. And so that was kind of background work to this, really, that we wanted to continue, and hopefully we will be able to continue at some stage. And we had, as someone was talking about the importance of really wording your leafleting carefully, and that's something that we have to look at as well. You know, we didn't say come and have a chat about, we just said come and have a chat. So we left it open, yeah.
Sounds really good. A story like emerged to me listening to you all, especially Elena, using these assemblies for this really like, you know, conflictuous thing that's going on locally. And what Annabelle said about needing to be resilient and needing to be able to endure kind of like a bit of discomfort. I remember like the sort of third or fourth assembly that I went to in London, this Black Lives Matter community circle, there was a speaker who at the beginning really sort of really shamed the organizers and some of the, you know, and sort of generally the whole setup, and was talking about, you know, the lack of young Black people there, how not enough work had been done to reach out to them. And I was sitting on the grass just like, you know, full of, you know, I'm not saying, you know, I'm not proud of this feeling, but I was just full of sort of like white guilt and fragility and whatever. And I was just like wanted to melt into the grass, you know, especially because I was like, you know, I'm behind the assemblies, you know, this is what I'm talking about. And he was just, you know, blew it out of the water. And the chat went on and we got into breakout groups, and I sort of explained, you know, this is how I'm feeling like super just, you know, discombobulated. And I guess to cut a long story short, the assembly happened, we all talked, and the end was like euphoric. There were people coming up and sharing, saying, you know, at first I agreed with the guy who got up here first of all and was slating you all, but actually, you know, there was a bunch of white people in my group, and I've never heard so many white people talk about, you know, the need for them to sort of like step back and show solidarity, and being totally aware of their privilege and how they should be using it. And I think it's really important that, you know, we're all here having this conversation together. And you know, and she was just one person. There was more and more of these people talking about how transformative this process had been. I felt sort of like as though I'd just gone through this whole process. And I guess that was the sort of just a closing thought that I had. Like, it will be really uncomfortable, but there's a kind of trust that you need to have in the process, I think. And that when stuff like that comes up, that needs to come up, and it needs to be said. And trusting that like the process will let you work through it together is really important. So that was just a little story I wanted to leave you all with. And I guess I will say before we go that next week is the last week, and the core session is being organized by Peter McFadden and Mags and Hester, and that's going to be a really beautiful like exploration of the imagination and all the possibilities of community organizing, and some great stories of how to do it. So that'll be really exciting. And there are two other supplementary workshops. One is by Peter Anderson, and it's on really quite practical, like how to how to do community organizing in a more sort of traditional, like strategic way. So that's a workshop. And the other workshop is about doing direct action, and creative ideas coming up with creative ideas for, you know, if out of the assembly there's a clear issue, how might you be able to brainstorm some interesting direct action that can, that your community members can get involved in, and that can let you really, you know, take power in that way. And then I think on Friday is going to be a nice graduation ceremony. I don't know what time that's going to be, but it'll be, you know, an hour and a half, and just a chance for us to check in with each other, talk about the program, and talk about maybe next steps and how we can stay in touch and how we can go and start doing this stuff in our communities. So that's all I've got to say.
Joining a hive as well. I can see loads of people in the chat want to know more about joining a hive. You'll get information about that in your follow-up email. So a hive is like your kind of support group, like your little community organizing family. Will allocate you to a little group of about 8 or 9 people, and you can meet up on Zoom every couple of weeks and just share your adventures and support each other, because it takes a lot of bravery, this stuff. So we do recommend that support set up. So yeah, look out for that.
So there'll be a link in the email, which just takes you to a Google form, and then we can put you in hives. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Best of luck. See you next week. You're all fantastic.
Bye, everyone.